Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're going to be doing another installment of the weekly meta breakdown where we look at the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder. This particular video is for standard best of 1 format. If you're going to look for best of 3, if you're looking for Explorer, Historic, we'll probably get around to an Alchemy one once the new set drops as well, since there'll likely be some sort of shake-up there. But we try to cover as many of the formats every week, looking at trends in terms of what are the best performing decks on the ladder, and we take a statistical look at this, and we have a bunch of data coming in from UntapGG, what you see on the screen. So this is a companion app that tracks like win rate data. You can use it as well. The link is in the video description. It's got a whole bunch of cool like in-game features as well. So we're going to be looking at standard best of 1 today. This is going to be actually a pretty lengthy video. There's a lot of diversity right now in standard. There's kind of deviations on certain archetypes, but there's a good representation of quite a few different types of decks, colors that we haven't seen in the past. Like when I was doing these videos a couple months ago, it was like the same 3 decks that I was talking about every week. But I got like 10 decks today to share with you. And we have 150,000 games of Magic that we're looking at data. So this is a huge data set for only a week of data. Standard is very popular right now. So we're going to dive into it. Just a quick housekeeping note. We are trying on the channel to reach 10,000 subs by June. We are in the mid 7,000. So if you haven't hit subscribe to the channel yet, it's free, it's easy, helps out the channel growth. As well, it lets you know every week when we come live with any of the new videos, gameplay content, stuff like that. And if you are sub to the channel, your continued likes and comments go a long way. It's great interacting with you, and it also helps with the YouTube algorithm overlords. But let's jump into it. So like I said, February 18th through to the 25th. February is almost done, so gotta push that top 1200 finish in Mythic if you haven't. We're gonna look at Diamond to Mythic rank, 150,000 matches of Magic played. So really big sample size. And we're just gonna jump into it. The top performing deck of the week. The Soldiers are back on top. Azorius Soldiers had kind of dropped like mid-pack the last couple weeks. They've always been represented, but it's kind of been a contentious battle between the blue-white version and the mono-white version. I'm actually going to cover the mono-white version directly after this, even though it's not the second most winningest deck. I just like, because we're talking about similar decks, it's easier to compare and contrast at that point there. So this is a 70%, almost 71% win rate deck, 140 matches. So the thing is with Soldiers, there's a lot of variation. There hasn't been a ubiquitous, like this is the 60 cards we're playing for Soldiers. The deviations at times are the 2-drop slot, and then whether or not you're playing Myrel, and then the number of like 3-drop configurations. So Harbin at times can be anywhere between a 2 to 4 of. Resolute Reinforcements is usually kind of tied to the number of Harbins you play, just because you want to have the widest board possible. This is a very aggressively slanted deck that's playing on synergies of being Soldiers. So you like your Yodian frontliner can pump your another attacker. Recruitment Officer finds all these creatures here, so it's good late game mana sink. Your Valiant Veteran is a Lord effect and then can put counters on things. Harbin's like a really big just I win swing. So if you get stuck in board stalls against like another low to the ground aggro deck, once you hit that 5 attacking soldier mark, everything takes to the skies. They get a boost, they get evasion in terms of flying as well. Brutal Cathar is the only removal in this deck, with the exception of an Iganjo. You have Valiant Veteran, and then you, sorry, not Valiant, the Siege Veteran, which puts counters and then is kind of like removal insurance. And then you also have Sky Strike Officer, which provides you some card advantage, and then Soldiers the like. Myrel is really if your opponent can't answer this, it's just going to run away with the games. This is one of the only creatures in the deck that on its own doesn't get hit by Brotherhood's End, which helps in that regard there. Doesn't get hit by Cut Down, where pretty much every other creature in the deck does get hit by Cut Down. The one thing with this mana base, you can play the new dual land from the most recent set, the blue-white one, the Seachrome Coast, I think it's the name. In addition to just like fixing up the mana base, I'd probably just cut out all the islands and then 1 plains. You really only need blue in 2 instances, and you have a lot of ways to create blue mana, but just an increased, like, you want as many dual lands as possible. I'd also play the full Adhikar Wastes as well. You have the dual lands, play them. It allows you to not play basic island. Because really what you don't want in this deck is like, 2 basic islands and you have a bunch of white cards in hand. You have good mana kind of sinks in Fortified Beachhead, along with the Valiant Veteran, and like Yodian can be unearthed, kind of mixed into there with the Recruitment Officer. So that's the blue-white version. So the mono-white version, I did on Friday. I'm going to start doing kind of weekend top 3 decks of Mythic. So this deck was doing a little bit better in Mythic rank, was in the mid-60s, a little bit higher, but it's very similar in terms of configuration. This mono-white version obviously has the cleaner mana, so you're not going to run the risk of having any lands come into play tapped. You're also not going to run into any pain lands, stuff like that. You get access to lay down arms since you're playing a number of planes. So this is a removal spell that can scale late game. So in this deck, you have 8 removal spells. You also have Guardian of New Benalia, which allows you to discard cards to give it indestructible. You can also enlist to kind of, like if a creature can't get an attack in, you can kind of move the power to Guardian for the turn. You can take advantage of stuff in the graveyard between these 2 cards, Yodian Frontliner and Valiant Veteran, to get some value off that. And then you're still on the Myrel plan with a Wandering Emperor on the top end. So this version's got cleaner mana. You don't have as many mana sinks, while you do have the Mishra's Foundry. You don't have like the utility land in Fortified Beachhead, as well as you don't have the card advantage or kind of evasion ability of Harbin. I generally prefer the Azorius version. I like Guardian of New Benalia and mono white shells that's playing Sarah Paragon, because then you can recast everything. So even for the turn, whatever you plan on casting, you can just discard. In these decks here, you're usually kind of, you get your initial wave of attackers, but at that point you run at a card advantage, whereas this Azorius version has ways to either deal with Flood or draws you cards with Sky Strike Officer. So then the second actual most winning deck of the week is Mono White Aggro. So 65%. So we had Mono White Humans. This is more of a traditional aggro list that's got some elements of soldiers, but just playing individually powerful white-based cards. So you have Hopeful Initiate, 1 mana, 1/2 that gets training. So when you attack with it and another creature with higher power, it gets counters on it, and then you can remove counters to destroy artifacts or enchantments. So there's a lot of incidental like artifact creatures, even in this deck. If we look at Skrelv, which is kind of a protection spell for you that can give you unblockable, or even Steel Seraph, which is another artifact creature that's usually played for 3 mana in this deck to give something flying, lifelink, or vigilance as well. This version of the deck is also on the laydown arms. Some of them may be playing Ossification, but usually it's just trying to keep your mana as efficient as possible. You have the Guardian of New Benalia, Thalia package, the same as the Soldier decks, but you're also playing Intrepid Adversary. So with this deck, you want to go wide, and then you use the Adversary to kind of be a Lord effect for your team. So where in the Soldiers decks, you have Valiant Veteran, in the Mono White deck, you're kind of using this Adversary as a similar style effect to deal with the fact that you have humans, knights, werewolves, clerics, all the type, Phyrexian mites. The real payoff in this version of the deck is you're playing Phyrexian Vindicator. So against decks like Mono Red, against Gruul, certain decks that aren't playing like white-based Exile, this card just wins the game in a way. Whenever it's dealt damage, you get to cancel out that damage and then redirect it to any other permanent. So you can deal to your opponent's face, you can pick off your opponent's creatures or planeswalkers, and just on its own, 4 mana, 5/5 flyer, closes the game out very quickly in a deck that's already very aggressive. You're backing that up with like Adelines, Anointed Peacekeepers that attack their hand. Even with Adeline, if you get a wide board, you can give a flying with Steel Seraph to kind of go over the top. And then 23 lands. It's a very mana-friendly deck in terms of like rare lands, but I think like every card in this deck's like a rare at least. Rare, mythic, rare. So it's not a budget deck by any means. Next deck, Mono Red Burn, Mono Red Aggro, 64% win rate, 110 games. And this is similar to Soldiers, where there's been a lot of variations in terms of the decks. Some go to Thundering Raiju and are more a little bit creature focused. Like they play the Red Adversary, to flashback spells. This one's the Mechanized Warfare version. And for the last couple weeks, we've actually seen the Mechanized Warfare version kind of fall out of favor in terms of the more Thundering Raiju focused version. Some of the red decks are also going to like 3 to 4 squeeze main board as well. But Warfare lets any of your damage from red spells deal an additional damage. So like ping effects from like Voldaren Aperture or the Kumano deal an extra damage. And the Festivities is a sweeper that hits your opponent's stuff, and with Festivities deals scalable damage. If you are seeing an increase in the number of like Soldiers decks, the Festivities is a good mirror breaker in that effect. And then you just have like cheap 1-drops, Reckless Impulse for card advantage, Burn and Play with Fire, and Lightning Strike. I don't really like the Chandra, to be honest, in Best of 1. It just gets hit by Invoke Despair, and it doesn't really provide too much like raw power. Like in some burn decks and like Pioneer, or like I run it in Historic in the sideboard of my best of 3 burn decks against control decks. But there's not too many traditional controls. In Best of 1, you're often going to be in like kind of creature mirrors, and they usually are able to attack your Chandra pretty easily. This does provide some nature of card draw, but you could even just look at either like more copies of Squee, or like there's a couple of 3-drops, the Vetna that prevents life gain, which is good against like Shieldred and stuff. There's also the Punisher card, the 3-mana 3/3 Menace, that each player takes damage equal to, it takes 2 damage on their upkeep if they have less than 2 basic lands in play, so good against all the kind of greedy mana bases. Alternatively, this deck is playing only 20 lands, which is a little low just given the curve. You are a number of 1-drops, but maybe worth going up to 21st land, or playing something like out of the mono white deck, you play a Mishra's Foundry, which is kind of like a utility land there. So that's some considerations with the deck there. Next up is Naya Humans. So this is another tribal deck, but the human variety this time. So this is a base white deck that's splashing for your Naya colors. You get access now to like Razorverge Thicket. You have your Pain lands, Secluded Courtyards, Plaza Heroes, so a lot of utility lands. And the payoffs in this deck, so you have your kind of same mono white effects, Hopeful Initiate, Intrepid Adversary, Thalia's, your kind of 3-drop package, but you get access to Catilda, which lets your humans tap for mana, and it's a mana sink to put counters on things. You have Malira, which is a 2-mana 3/3. Incidentally, Poison is a deck that we'll be covering, so it can limit poison counters, and then it's kind of insurance against creature removal, so you can exile Malira, choose another target creature or artifact. When it's put into the graveyard to this turn, you return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So say you have an Adeline out, they try to kill your Adeline, you sacrifice Malira, and you get Adeline back. You get Halana and Alana, a card that was popular last set, but it's kind of fallen out. This just gives like haste and a bunch of counters on all your threats. It just makes any kind of follow-up creature a big, chunky attacker. And then you have Sigarda, which is just an evasive kind of beat stick that is also an Anthem effect. And then if you have Coven, you can get some card advantage with it as well. A deck that I haven't seen in like a hot minute is Selesnya Enchantments, 62% win rate, just under. So this is a deck that's kind of like nothing new other than the mana base, and it was kind of the Kamigawa / Innistrad set of cards. So it's playing a bunch of enchantments, enchantment creatures to kind of get value. So you have things like Weaver of Harmony to double up counters. This version's not even playing the 2-mana green creature that gets a counter every time. The Mythic, I think it's Mythic. That card's really good because it keeps coming back from the graveyard. So this one's a little bit more of a budgety version in a way. You have like Fanga Shigeki here. Generous Visitor puts counters on things. Jukai Naturalist makes your enchantments cost less. Mishiko pumps a bunch of power into play. Catilda for evasion, and that scales. So with Weaver of Harmony, you can tap it. So things like Circle of Confinement, exile 2 things. Spirited Companion, draw 2 things. And then this version of the deck's on Hallowed Haunting. So whenever you cast an enchantment, you get a spirit, which is power equal to the number of spirits you control. So it's scalar. And then if you control 7 or more enchantments, all your creatures get flying and vigilance. So kind of the evasion built in. The big thing for this deck is now you have access to 8 dual lands that come into play untapped on turn 1. So you're able to get like your green into white more consistent. So consistent mana goes a long way. This deck's kind of fallen off, especially since like Naya Humans was very popular. That deck was so much fun. That deck could just be like, oops, I attack you for like $1 billion. Going on the Selesnya train, we have Selesnya Toxic, so shade over 61%. Pretty big sample size here. And this deck here is looking to poison your opponent. Now, Rot Priest, there's the Simic kind of gimmicky version that could sometimes get your opponent, but if you didn't draw a Rot Priest, your deck's just a bunch of protection spells and you do nothing. And you still die to Invoke Despair somehow. But with this version here, Rot Priest does have some ways to target it, but it's really just incidental. All your creatures have Toxic, so you have ways of just, like, even if they just target Rot Priest or you get in for an attack, they just get a Toxic counter. So with this deck, you're kind of simultaneously trying to get them 10 poison or 20 damage. I've played some versions of these Toxic decks. They're really fun, actually, and they're quite competitive. But the mana base is cool with this deck because you have like the Seed Core, which taps for any color to cast Phyrexian spells. All your creatures are Phyrexian. Mirrex lets you create mites. But like Crawling Chorus, Toxic, when it dies you get a mite. The Skrelv is protection. You have Tyvar's Stand as protection. Soul Partition can be used either aggressively or defensively. You could use it on your own creature and then just recast it. Also really good with Rot Priest. The Slaughter Singer is a really unique kind of Lord effect. While it's not static, like this creature gets +1/1, it's when it attacks. The one thing to note, though, is if you plan on using the Seed Core to target a mite, you need to target the mite before you attack with Slaughter Singer, because it'll make it a 2/2, and then this doesn't work anymore. That's come up a couple times accidentally. You have Skrell's Hive, which lets you create kind of a Bitter Blossom for the more boomerish of us who played quite some time ago. But it creates a mite every turn, you lose a life, and then if your opponent's corrupted with 3 or more poison, all your Toxic creatures have a lifelink as well. So it's really good in these aggressive mirrors because you start gaining life. You have the Jawbone Duelist, which is double strike and Toxic. If this gets in, it hits twice, so your opponent gets 2 poison counters. Annex Sentry is kind of the Brutal Cathar in this deck. Notably, it can only exile value 3 or less. So it can't hit Shieldred, it can't hit Phyrexian Obliterator, stuff like that. And then it's also Toxic. And then Bloated Contaminator. This is kind of the big top end of the deck. 3 mana 4/4 Trample is a scary creature on its own. Toxic, so it could deal, but then it also has Proliferate when it deals combat damage. So you could double up any counters on your creatures. Or if you have the poison counter ready on your opponent, they get an additional poison counter there. Really good mana base in Selesnya right now, which also helps that. Next up, Gruul Aggro. So this was actually the highest winning percentage deck from Friday in the Mythic rank. And this is a modify Gruul Aggro deck. So the addition of things with oil counters. So Evolving Adaptive, which gets bigger whenever you cast another creature. So like Experiment 1, Pelt Collector style effects that we're seeing from past sets. So this keeps getting bigger as you play more creatures. As well as Miglos, which enters with 5 oil counters. Both of those mean that your creatures are modified. Similarly with like things like Query and Beastcaller that gets counters on it. Like the counter from Kumano, from a Thundering Raiju. Those are all ways to modify your creatures. So your Raiju then deals a whole bunch of incidental damage. Your Kami's Flare deals 3 damage to the creature plus 2 damage to face. You got Lightning Strike as removal. You have Protection with Tyvar's Stand. And then Hajar can be used both just as a good body. 2 mana 3/3. Solid rate. And then you could sacrifice it to give your legendary creatures indestructible. So your Miglos or Squee can also become indestructible in this deck here. Another deck that benefited from a fast line in Copperline Gorge. These got so cheap in paper. I got the full arts for like $5. These things were like $20+ before the reprint. But this is a deck I'm interested in. I want to try it out, see how it plays out. Next up, Grixis Midrange. So a lot of people always ask me like, where's Grixis in these rankings? Because Grixis is a very prominent deck in standard best of 3. Now these mid-range decks tend to do better in best of 3, and that's even like in formats like Explorer, where you see Rakdos being a very popular deck. The reason being is they're able to kind of shift their game plan. So in matchups where they like aggressive decks, they can bring in more Brothers Hoods Ends or Sweepers or more targeted removal, stuff like that. Whereas in like a control matchup, you could bring counter spells in or discard, stuff of that nature. It's a little hard to walk that line because you're going to have matchups where, like, say you run into control and you have all these dead cards. Or against really aggressive decks, like, I don't like Bankbuster in best of one. It's too slow. Like, if you're on turn 2 casting a 2-mana do nothing, and your opponent's like on the play, they can already have 3 creatures out. Or like kill you with soldiers on turn 4. So I usually like to scale down on the Reckoner Bankbusters. I would probably play like 1 to 2 at most. I'd probably play like 2 Brotherhood's End against a Soldiers meta, and then maybe like 4 cut down, go for the throats, or like another cut down, something of that nature. Just to have some flexibility. But the core of the deck is just like every card you have is either a kill spell or replaces itself or provides you like card advantage and like value. So like Bloodtithe Harvester with a flipped reflection of Kiki is just absurd. Fables, just like the glue that holds this deck together. You get rid of the wrong half of your deck. You get something to help you ramp, so you can get like turn 4 Invoke Despair out. And then Kiki on its own is, if you have 2 reflections of Kiki at your opponent's end step, based on the amount of mana you have, you can make that many copies of Reflection of Kiki to attack your opponent. Corpse Appraiser is a card advantage engine that can be copied with Fable. Sheoldred is just a hell of a card against some of the aggressive decks if they can't kill it. And then Invoke Despair just deals with like your entire opponent's board if they're not going super wide. And then it also, like, incidentally against mono red hits like their Mechanized Warfare as an example, or like a Planeswalker, stuff of that nature. So that's the Grixis deck. Then go to Azorius Control, 58%. This was another deck that was in like the mid-60s in the Mythic ranked video I did over the weekend, or on Friday. So this deck here is a Mind Splice Apparatus deck. So this can be flashed in on your opponent's turn, or like at the end of your opponent's turn, when you have 4 mana, and then at the upkeep you put an oil counter on it, and your spells cost 1 less for each counter on it. So it's playing a lot of X spells that take advantage of the cost reduction. So like Syncopate could eventually just become blue, 1 blue mana counter unless your opponent pays mana equal to the number of oil counters. March can then like scale and hit like 5 drops, 6 drops, where usually it's a little harder to do stuff like that. Silver Scrutiny draws you a bunch of cards. White Sun Zenith sweeps their board, gives you, this is your win condition with the deck, and gives you a bunch of toxic mites to try to attack your opponent. Union draws you a card, gains you a bunch of life, plays really nice after like a big Silver Scrutiny. Sweepers and Depopulate. Devious Cover-Up lets you shuffle back into your library certain cards, so like you could keep recycling your White Sun Zeniths or whatever is relevant in the matchups, and then the Memory Deluge as card advantage. Again, some of the greedier decks, if they're not playing basics, like sometimes Esper doesn't play basics, you can just keep strip mining your opponent. Then we go to Mono White Control, kind of Mono White mid-range, 58% win rate. So this is the bigger version of the deck. So this isn't unlike the aggro decks. This version's looking to go to the long game and kind of outvalue your opponent. So you have 8 removal spells in the form of Laydown Arms, as well as Ossification, which can scale and deal with Planeswalkers. You're playing a number of basics, so you target that. Ambitious Farmhand for ramp, Cathar Commando, Flash Blocker that can blow up artifacts, enchantments, Bankbuster for card advantage, Anointed Peacekeeper as a tax effect, Lauren blows up artifacts or enchantments, so Mechanized Warfare, Reflections of Kiki, sometimes of like the mono white decks, if they're playing like Steel Seraph like we saw, can blow it up. Wedding Announcements for tokens, and then an Anthem effect. Sarah Paragon can play any of your permanents in this kind of pocket. Wandering Emperor for exile, just creatures, and just this card kind of can take over games at times. AO, good like offense defense card, and when it dies you get to find any of your permanents here. Steel Seraph lets you play it as either 3 or 6 mana, gives your like AO lifelink or some of your creatures flying, whatever's relevant. And then the Eternal Wander, this is kind of a one-sided board wipe. It can be just making a bunch of 0, like for the 0 ability, 2/2 double strikes, or +1 you get to exile and return. So it lets you potentially go offense defense. You can attack with a creature, blink it. You have a bunch of enter the battlefield effects. So like even with Steel Seraph, you cast for 3 mana, you exile it, it gets returned, it comes back as a 6 mana side. Your Laurens get bounced, your Anointed Peacekeepers, your Farmhands, and you can also target your opponent's tokens and they just get exiled. Roadside Reliquary as a card advantage spell. You have artifacts and enchantments in the deck, and then that can also be played from your graveyard with Sarah Paragon, so you can get extra copies of that as well. Then lastly, as I catch my breath, Mono Black. We're calling this one Control, but I'd probably classify it as aggro. The distinction I usually make is, are they on Cult Conscripts and extra 1-drops? This version looks kind of weird, to be honest. Like, it was the highest rated Mono Black deck, but before you play any Cult Conscripts or Akiba, you should be playing 4 Evolved Sleepers. You should also be playing Go for the Throat over Infernal Grasp, so you don't take damage. I would make those changes. But this version here, you're on the Trespassers, Lily, Tenacious Underdogs, as one of Soul Transfer. It's not as good without Meat Hook anymore, but you do have like some enchantments here, like a Junji. This isn't like the best Mono Black version, to be honest. Let me see if there's another Mono Black. Like, it's got a higher win rate than some of the other ones, but it looks pretty bad. Is this I want to find an Invoke one. Alright, we'll look at this one. I just don't want to, like, the configuration of this deck just looks really bad. Like, it looks like it's Mono Black that was built, but doesn't have all the cards. So this is the more aggressive one, so this would be the non-Invoke Despair Mono Black. So like I mentioned, 4 Evolved Sleepers, you have your Cult Conscripts here. This version is taking advantage of the more 1-drops because you have Gix. 8 2 mana, like, good attacking creatures. The Misery Shadow, you just pump mana into it. It also is when things die, they get exiled instead, so it eliminates death triggers. Tenacious Underdogs keep coming back. This one you see, like, it's got some cut downs. It's got Go for the Throats and some Infernal Grasps. Trespasser for Graveyard Hate, and just like a good attacker. It's hard to deal with. Liliana. This deck here, you're often going to be dumping your hand fairly early, so it's a little bit better. Where the other one, you're kind of heavier on the curve, so you're often going to be discarding your own cards. Shieldred, and then the Phyrexian Fleshgorger is likely going to be a 3-drop, but can be cast late game as a 7-drop. You have your Mishra's Foundries as additional attackers in the deck here as well. So if you're looking like that, the Invoke versions usually won't playing Fleshgorger, usually plays 1 to 2 Lilianas, and then usually the number here is usually like maybe shave off 1. I'd probably do 4 Go for the Throats if you're on the Invoke, cut out the Infernal Grasps, and then maybe trim 1 of these, and then like a Liliana as well if you want to play Invoke Despair. But 25 lines is good for an Invoke Despair version. So that's it for the week. This one was a long one. We cover a lot of different decks, but let me know what you think, what you've been enjoying playing, and for those pushing for top 1200, good luck. Hope you can get it. Thanks for watching.